I've got news for you.
Welcome to CitizenView,
where citizens come to talk.
Say, we're the two teachers, and we're thinking back 50 years ago this month. John F. Kennedy was president, and the United States was on the brink of nuclear war. Andy, we're talking the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we're talking presidential foreign policy.
We're talking presidential foreign policy, but we're also talking about what we can learn even 50 years later from the Cuban Missile Crisis about how our current presidents get advice, particularly in times of crisis.
50 years ago, the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, had begun building a nuclear launch site on the island of Cuba, just miles from the Florida border. Andy, this was the Cold War at its hottest moment. Historians project, had a nuclear war been initiated in October of '62, 200 million lives lost. Andy, it was the closest we ever came to World War III. How did the presidents act, and what can we learn today?
Well, the presidents acted by bringing in key advisors to give them advice, and it's really the model for crisis decision-making today, or foreign policy decision-making, that President Obama, President George W. Bush, every president really implements now. And that is, you put people in the room who aren't necessarily those people who have been appointed by and approved by the Senate, but increasingly they're officials from the executive office of the president, chiefly the National Security Advisor and other aides that you really trust.
So you're saying, Andy, when we elect a president, we're really electing a posse. Not only are we electing one person who we're going to trust to make those crucial and important decisions, but he brings with him advisors. He brings with him trusted officials with experience. Maybe these are some of the questions we should be asking at the debates. What do we get when we vote for a Romney? What do we get when we vote for an Obama?
Well, remember, you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, some of the military folk were giving this young president the advice of doing strikes, airstrikes on Cuba, which likely would have led to some kind of nuclear conflict. It was the person he trusted most in the room who actually probably had the least foreign policy experience, and that was his brother Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, who was really giving him key advice, along with the National Security Advisor, who isn't approved by the U.S. Senate. And Kennedy was listening to these voices that he trusted rather than to that old hierarchy of the military as he made those crucial decisions 50 years ago.
We know the prevailing view was to strike, but in the end, Kennedy made that decision to quarantine, to blockade Cuba, to look tough, but at the same time negotiate behind closed doors with Khrushchev and the Soviets. And Andy, we also know that they established that hotline, a direct communication between the United States and its formidable enemy, opening up communication lines. Maybe this is something we can learn today, Andy, that it's not just about showing how strong America is, but having that willingness, one, to talk, and two, to get all the information necessary.
And we see that same model probably in the crisis over in Libya on 9/11. Who are those people in the room giving the president advice? Some of them are the military voices and the cabinet voices that you would expect to hear. But we also know from the Kennedy days that presidents also surround themselves with people who might not be specialists in that particular field, but people who they know they can trust.
Andy, you've talked about the word trust. You've also talked here today at CitizenView about surrounding yourself with advisors. Something maybe we haven't talked about is transparency. There wasn't a lot of transparency back in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Could that be done today the same way it was done 50 years ago?
Well, I think the reality is that some of this information is even more classified and less transparent than it was 50 years ago. Because unless somebody's coming out years later with a tell-all book about what kind of advice George W. Bush was getting during before and after 9/11, what kind of advice was Obama getting before and after this 9/11 strike in Libya, you know, really the process these days is even less transparent, it seems like.
Say, I'm reminded of that famous quip, if a person loses sight of the ultimate, you become a slave to the immediate. And when we think about who we're going to elect on November 6th, the ultimate responsibility of any president is to carry the power of the sword very carefully, to keep us safe, to keep us secure. When we vote, let's think about who do we trust to make good decisions, who has surrounded himself with the right advocates and advisors, and do we trust them to make that crucial big decision? Because this we know for sure, foreign policy matters. We learned that lesson 50 years ago with the Cuban Missile Crisis. This has been Citizen View, and we're the two teachers.
No fancy words, no fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.